In 1953, South Korea was poorer than Haiti. Let that sink in. The country was rubble. Cities flattened, bridges gone. Factories burned. The Korean War had turned the southern half of the peninsula into a scarred battlefield. Per capita income hovered around $67 a year. Most people worked in agriculture. Many were illiterate. Electricity was unreliable. Food was scarce. If you had to bet on which country would dominate shipbuilding, smartphones, semiconductors, cars, and K-pop within a single lifetime, South Korea would not have made the list. And yet today, South Korea is the world's 10th, 13th largest economy. Depending on the year, home to global giants, a manufacturing powerhouse, a cultural exporter, a democracy, a country whose citizens live longer than Americans and earn incomes comparable to Western Europe. So how did a war-torn agrarian state become an industrial titan in just a few decades? The answer is not magic. It's not culture alone. It's not just hard work. It's a deliberate system, ruthless at times, fragile in ways people don't like to talk about. And that system still shapes the global economy today. To understand it, we have to start with a strange alliance, generals and businessmen. In 1961, a military officer named Park Chung-hee took power in a coup. Democracy paused. The country was desperate. Park looked at the global map and saw something simple. Small countries with no natural resources don't get rich by looking inward. They get rich by selling to the world. South Korea had no oil, no vast mineral reserves, no giant domestic market like the United States. If it wanted to survive, it had to export. But here's the problem. Exporting requires factories, technology, capital, skilled workers. South Korea had almost none of that, so the government built it, not directly, at least not in the Soviet sense. Instead, it created a partnership with private family-owned conglomerates that would later be known as Chaebol Massive Business. Empires spanning dozens of industries, names you know, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, SK. In the early 1960s, these companies were small and fragile. The government selected a handful and said, in effect, we will give you cheap loans, tax breaks, protection from foreign competition, and access to imported technology. In return, you will hit export targets, miss them, and we cut you off. This wasn't a free market fairy tale. It was disciplined capitalism. Banks were controlled. By the state, credit was directed. If the government wanted more ships, money flowed to shipyards. If it wanted more steel, funds poured into steel mills. The winners weren't decided by quarterly earnings. They were decided by national strategy. The early focus was simple, light manufacturing, textiles, wigs, cheap goods for foreign buyers. It worked. Exports exploded from 55 million in 1962 to over 1 billion by 1971. That kind of growth changes a country's psychology. Suddenly, poverty didn't feel permanent, but Park wasn't satisfied with cheap shirts. In the 1970s, South Korea made a bold, some would say reckless leap into heavy and chemical industries. Steel, shipbuilding, automobiles, petrochemicals, industries that required enormous capital and long-term bets. The global oil shock hit, debt mounted. Critics said it was unsustainable. Yet the government doubled down, consider shipbuilding. In the early 1970s, South Korea had almost no experience building massive ocean-going vessels. Japan dominated. Europe had legacy expertise. South Korea had ambition and cheap labor. Hyundai took on a massive order to build supertankers before it even had a finished shipyard. It borrowed heavily. The government backed the loans. The risk was absurd, but they delivered. Within 2 decades, South Korea became the world's leading shipbuilder. The pattern repeated: choose an industry, flood it with capital, protect it domestically, force it to compete globally, scale aggressively, climb the value chain. Steel fed shipbuilding. Shipbuilding fed machinery. Machinery fed automobiles. Electronics emerged over time. Assembly turned into innovation. There's a quiet irony here. South Korea's rise is often celebrated as a triumph of capitalism. But its early decades looked more like state-guided industrial warfare. And it was effective. Between 1960 and 1990, South Korea's GDP per capita increased more than 20-fold. Poverty plummeted, education soared. The country invested heavily in universal schooling. By the 1980s, it had one of the highest rates of secondary education in the world. Human capital became its real natural resource, but rapid growth hides cracks. By the 1990s, the Chaebol had grown enormous. They were sprawling across industries, often borrowing heavily to fund expansion. Because banks were historically aligned with government policy, lending decisions were sometimes based on strategic importance rather than strict risk assessment. Debt piled up. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis hit. Currencies collapsed across Southeast Asia. Investors panicked. South Korea's short-term foreign debt suddenly looked terrifying. The won plunged. Major conglomerates failed. The country had to request a bailout from the International Monetary Fund. For a nation that had built its identity on resilience and pride, this was humiliating. But crises reveal systems. South Korea restructured. It forced Chaebol to reduce debt. It liberalized parts of its financial system. It opened more to foreign investment. It strengthened corporate governance, at least on paper. And then something interesting happened. Instead of retreating, South Korea leaned even harder into technology. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the government aggressively invested in broadband infrastructure. High-speed internet spread rapidly. By the mid-2000s, South Korea had one of the fastest and most widespread broadband networks in the world. This mattered because the next phase of wealth wasn't steel or ships. It was semiconductors, smartphones, digital displays, advanced manufacturing. Samsung transformed from a low-cost manufacturer into a global technology leader. Hyundai became a serious competitor in global auto markets. Korean companies climbed into the top tiers of memory chip production. The uncomfortable math here is scale plus specialization. South Korea has a population of around 50 million, that's smaller than many countries that struggle economically. But it focused on industries where global demand is massive and margins improve with scale. Memory chips are sold worldwide, ships sail everywhere, cars cross borders, electronics fill homes across continents. The domestic market was never enough, so the world became the market. Exports today account for a huge share of South Korea's GDP, often around 40% or more. That makes the country wealthy. It also makes it vulnerable. When global demand slows, South Korea feels it quickly. When the semiconductor cycle dips, growth stutters. When trade tensions rise, anxiety spreads. And then there's China. For years, China was both a partner and a competitor. South Korea exported components to Chinese factories. But over time, Chinese firms climbed the value chain. They began competing directly in electronics, shipbuilding, and even automobiles. The very model that made South Korea rich, export-led industrialization, now faces rivals using similar playbooks at even larger scale. There's another tension few like to discuss: concentration. A significant portion of South Korea's GDP is tied to a handful of Chaebol. Samsung alone represents a massive share of exports and stock market value. When one company sneezes, the entire economy catches a cold. This creates a strange dynamic. On one hand, the country champions innovation and entrepreneurship. On the other, small and medium enterprises often struggle in the shadow of giants that control supply chains, financing, and distribution networks. Inequality, while lower than in some Western countries, is a growing political issue. Youth unemployment periodically spikes. Housing prices in Seoul have soared. The education system, once a ladder of mobility, has become intensely competitive and stressful. In other words, the miracle has side effects, yet zoom out and the transformation remains staggering. In 1953, South Korea relied heavily on foreign aid. Today, it is a donor nation. It hosts global events. Its companies shape critical technologies. Its culture, from cinema to music, influences global audiences. This last piece is not trivial. Economic power often precedes cultural influence, but cultural exports can reinforce economic strength. Soft power attracts talent, tourism, and global attention. It creates brand value that money alone cannot buy. Still, the core engine remains industrial and technological competence at its heart. South Korea's wealth rests on three pillars. First, relentless export orientation. The country never forgot that its domestic market was too small. From day one, the question was, what can we sell to the world? Second, state-guided coordination during critical growth phases. The government did not leave development to chance. It chose sectors, directed credit, imposed discipline, then gradually loosened control as firms matured. Third, human capital. Massive investments in education created a workforce capable of moving from low-skill assembly to advanced engineering within a generation. None of this was smooth. It involved authoritarian rule, financial crises, corporate scandals, political upheaval, even presidents imprisoned. The narrative is not clean, but perhaps that's the real lesson. South Korea did not become rich by following a textbook. It became rich by constantly adapting its system to global reality, sometimes harshly, sometimes painfully, and now it faces a new reality, an aging population, one of the lowest birth rates in the world, intensifying technological competition, a geopolitical tightrope between the United States and China, supply chains being reshuffled for security reasons. The export machine still runs, the semiconductor fabs still hum, the ships still launch. But the world is less stable than it was during the great globalization wave of the 1990s and 2000s. The uncomfortable question is whether the model that created the miracle can survive a world that is fragmenting. Can a mid-sized, hyper-export-dependent economy thrive if trade slows and blocks harden? Can conglomerates remain dominant without stifling the next generation of innovators? Can a society built on speed and pressure sustain itself as its population shrinks? South Korea's rise was one of the fastest in modern history. It compressed what took Europe a century into a few decades, but rapid ascents create high altitudes, and at high altitude, the air gets thin. The country that once shocked the world by rising from ruins now faces a subtler test. Not how to get rich, but how to stay rich in a world that no longer plays by the same rules. That story is still being written.